We're live now.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Yasmin. Hello everyone. My name is Yasmin and I'm the Nature and Food Campaigner with Greenpeace Canada. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that Greenpeace Canada is running. Workshop question that we in the Nature and Food team, along with many community partners, have been thinking about for a long time. What does a resilient, ethical, and ecological food system look like, and how can we transform our current model towards this? It's really important to talk about where we're at and what local producers, farm workers, and Indigenous communities, in addition to governments, in addition to what governments are doing, as we're facing multiple crises at the same time, a public health crisis, a food justice crisis, and a biodiversity and climate emergency. I would like to continue by acknowledging that Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them together to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The dish, or sometimes called the bowl, represents what is now Southern Ontario, from the Great Lakes to Quebec, and from Lake Simcoe to the United States. That means that we have to share responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures that we share with it. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that we must keep the peace. And this was a treaty that was originally made between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee after the French and Indian War. And anyone that steps foot into this territory is incorporated into this treaty. So I am honored and excited to be here talking with you about food in this time of crisis. I think a lot of us are searching for hope and actionable ways to make change during this really difficult time. So thank you for making time and space to join this conversation. Our work at Greenpeace and the Nature and Food Campaign focuses on transforming our food systems to be resilient in the face of crises, to be able to nourish everyone and ourselves with healthy and increasingly local, ecologically grown food. Critical to this food system transformation is tackling the inequities that the industrial food system cause. Inequities that include unfair labor practices, the loss of biodiversity, and cooking the climate. The good news, I think, is that transforming our food system is a big part of the solution to many of these. Grassroots leaders, community groups, and others have been saying for a long time that we need a new food system, one that values taking care of one another, that fosters food security, food sovereignty, and migrant justice. Moments of extreme disruption like this have a history of bringing change. Things that once seemed impossible suddenly seem viable. So today, we're joined by Syed Hassan, the Executive Director of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, Cheyenne Sundance, the founder and farmer of Sundance Harvest Farms, and Carolyn MacLeod, an Indigenous food sovereignty advocate, Mi'kmaq knowledge keeper, and filmmaker, to share their perspectives on our food system in this time of crisis. We are also super excited that we have with us to conclude our time together today as our musical guest to perform 2 songs is the incredible Toronto-based protest electronic duo Lal, Rosina Kazi and Nicholas Murray. So I want to remind everyone that's with us today, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have questions or comments for our wonderful panelists today, please send them along to us in the comment section in YouTube, and we'll get into a good discussion involving you all online. So first, I wanted to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm going to say to Hassan, take it away.
Hi, is this where I go for like 10 minutes? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Perfect. I'm going to just share a screen, team, to talk about our work. Give me one moment here. Okay. So again, my name is Syed Hassan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Migrant Workers Alliance Change, and I also work with the Migrant Rights Network. And I too wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. And when we do it as migrants, not just as something that's symbolic, but because we want to be very clear that we are not here talking about migrants displacing indigenous communities or migrants taking over indigenous lands, and that when particularly we're talking about food and farm workers, even the idea of whose land is it that food is being grown on that we consume. So our relationship with the so-called local food, how can it be through a lens of understanding and being in alliance with indigenous self-determination? So we do a lot of our work with our members to build up this analysis, and we see ourselves as allies in supporting migrants to be part of the work to be in alliance with indigenous struggles for self-determination. We are experiencing a global crisis of inequality, and I want to start there because before I come to really the question around food, and when I talk about food, I'm talking about everything from the farm to the factory where it's packaged, to the grocery store where it is sold and resold and repurposed, and to your table where you eat it, as well as the apps and the deliveries that you may be using to get food delivered to you. That is the entire food chain. But before we talk about the food chain in Canada, we have to talk about a global crisis of inequality. Right now, we are living in a world where the rich are getting richer, right? Just over 2,000 people have more wealth than the bottom half of our communities in our societies. In the context of Canada, 2 men have more money than a third of the country, and they are just getting richer every moment. And when you have this global crisis of inequality, what's been happening is all of the resources are being sucked from the south into here in the north, which is where we are sitting. So we can't just talk about better food for ourselves, better communities for ourselves, without understanding that that comes at a cost to people around the globe. And when we think about placing food in the context of climate change, particularly environmental change, organizations like Greenpeace trying to make this connection, we have to understand that the worst impacts of the climate catastrophe, just as the worst impacts of war and poverty, affect people in the global south. Here on your screen, I'm showing an image that shows you which countries are the least likely to survive the climate catastrophe. And as you can see, it is countries in the global south that will be worst affected. In places like Canada and the United States, that will be well off and fine, frankly. And then we have to understand that when we're talking about climate crisis, we're not actually talking about major weather events. In fact, the vast majority of climate change related activities is a result of biodegradation, people being forced into poverty out of their communities because of low yield in agriculture, and are then being forced to move into the cities and eventually to move to the global north, right? So there's this global displacement that's happening, and it's not just floods, right? It's actually mass impoverishment, particularly affecting women and trans people. And so as people are being forced to move around the world, when they're arriving in Canada, they're arriving here as temporary. In fact, each year, over 700,000 people, over 2/3 of all migrants that come to Canada are on temporary work permits, temporary study permits, and refugee claimant. We have a temporary immigration system. Today, there are approximately 1.3 to potentially 2 million people. So over more than 1 in 20 people in Canada are actually non-permanent residents. These are by and large low income, low wage, racialized people. These are the people who grow your food. These are the people who deliver your food. These are the people who are selling in the grocery stores. These are the people who are cleaning up in hospitals and healthcare facilities. It's domestic workers taking care of children, sick, and the elderly. The entire infrastructure of the poorest in the country is actually migrant and undocumented people who are the breathing heart of what we are facing today. And migrant workers, as you know, are being termed essential. As you have seen in the last 6 weeks, we have faced one of the worst public health pandemics in recent history. Canada closed its borders to migrants, and when it did so soon after, there was this absolute outrage. Here are just some of the headlines where migrants were suddenly, the country woke up and said, oh, these are essential workers. Without it, our entire food system will collapse. And I think people are waking up to the fact that the vast majority of food production in the country is actually being done on the backs of seasonal, they're called seasonal, but we have members who've been coming here for 20, 25 years at a time to grow food in this country. That is no longer seasonal. That is no longer a temporary labor shortage, but there is a permanent pool of labor local. So your local 10-mile diet is actually being grown by people who've traveled 10,000 kilometers to come here. And at the same time, the migrants have the fewest possible rights. I mean, I show you just this one screenshot where migrant workers, these are the same essential workers who are being brought into the country, who are being, facing snakes, rats, bed bugs, and abuse. We have migrant workers who've been here and placed in quarantine for the first 14 days on their arrival. You have to be quarantined, and employers giving them one bag of potatoes for 13 workers to eat over the course of a week. We have workers who are not being paid, who are not allowed to leave the farm because they're quarantining for the health and safety of so-called Canadians, while at the same time, because they cannot leave the farm, they have no access to food, cell phones, to be able to send money home to their families, to be able to get life-saving and essential medicine. Not just that, I mean, this is not just in terms of COVID, but in general, there's a long-term impact where migrant workers are on employer-dependent work permits, which means you are tied to an employer. To change your job, just imagine this for a moment, to change your job, you have to find another employer who applies for something called a labor market impact assessment that takes 3 to 6 months and costs them $1,000. Of course, that money is downloaded to you. Then you apply for a work permit for which also takes 3 to 6 months. So you may be unemployed for 6 to 12 months. During that period, you are not able to get any income. And because you live in employer controlled housing, you're also homeless. And you are not allowed to start a new job. So you can't work, you don't have income, you don't have social support, and you're homeless. Thus, we have created a system of food production that requires an indentured workforce. That is how Canada feeds itself. Not just Canada feeds itself, but Canada is the world's 6th largest agricultural exporter. We've been hearing a lot about the food supply is going to be impacted because of border closures, but it's actually the global food supply. Most of the food grown in this country is for export. And of course, we are seeing that migrants are the worst impacted in this pandemic. Today, if you take out, other than healthcare facilities, the workplaces, which have seen the most amount of COVID-19 outbreaks, the top 4 are all places with primarily a migrant workforce. Byland Nurseries in Kelowna, Green Hill Produce, which the numbers are now nearly 50 in Chatham, Ontario, and then Cargill Meats and JBS Packing in Alberta. Now, it's also very important to remember that Cargill and JBS are 2 out of the 3 companies that control all beef processing, 95% of beef processing in the country. We have a consolidated food system where a few corporations control not just all of the food processing, but also there's only 5 grocery stores who control the vast majority of grocery stores. So, your Walmart, your Metro, your Loblaws, your Costco. And of course, one of the richest men in the country is the owner of Loblaws. And so we are seeing this thing where migrants are essential. They're keeping the food supply running. They have been denied rights historically and now are being the worst impacted in this pandemic, while there are almost no government supports for us. And while the food system is controlled by the richest few, it's important to know that migrants aren't just victims or aren't just vulnerable, but that migrants are actually people with the most solutions. Here, for example, these are migrant farm workers from Jamaica, some of our members, who are working in a vineyard in Niagara. And in this vineyard, these migrants were they were seeing that the corporation was seeing a huge lack of, huge drop in crop yield as a result of changes in weather and soil conditions. And these migrant farm workers taught them how to produce biochar, which is essentially to burn what's the leftover of the grapevines to add nutrients into the land. And this concept is now being copied in grape vineyards across the country. These workers never got a cent. They were never even given permanent resident status. Each year, they have to wait to be re-invited into the country to come on a temporary basis to be able to live in those bunkhouses that I just showed you, full of rats and bedbugs. So what are we doing in this moment? The first thing that we're doing is that we have created a national organization with over 50, almost all self-organized groups of migrants, refugees, and undocumented people to demand healthcare for all. Our people don't have healthcare. To demand worker protections, which includes income support, particularly in this moment. There's been a lot of crisis response and income support. Our people, many of them aren't getting it. And fundamentally, we're calling for status for all. It is if migrants are essential workers, they are the people who grow the food, clean the country, keep the grocery store stocked, and deliver food to your homes. which is a lot of people, then they deserve permanent resident status. We're calling for community support. Tomorrow is May Day, and many of our people can't pay rent. And we're demanding that the federal government meet with us because it has to be self-determination. Our communities have to speak to us directly. And we need to be sitting at the table with the federal government to make these changes. But we're doing more than that. I mean, we're seeing so much crisis in our communities. You'll see these are in farms, we've been dropping off tissue paper, toilet paper. As you can see, this is just one photo. Food, because many migrant farm workers don't have the basic supplies that their employers are providing them. But migrant workers are also speaking up. They're not silent. As I said, migrant workers are not just vulnerable and victims. So I'm going to show you a very brief 2-minute video speaking from our members. This has actually never been screened before. It's going to premiere tomorrow. I'll speak about that in a moment, but you get to see it for the first time. Can you hear? No? Sorry. 1 second. Apologies, team. What is happening here? One second, I'm going to try one more time. Oh, here we go. It's muted for some reason. Someone's chatting with me, probably telling me that. Public health crisis. Unless we protect everyone, we cannot protect anyone.
I got my wife, that is, her due date is on May 29th. Me and my wife, we don't have an SIN, a valid SIN number. And still we are asked to stay home. But the reality is that I cannot stay home. I don't have any kind of support. I need to hustle basically every day.
Ahora con el problema del COVID-19 no he podido ir a trabajar a Canadá. Y como nuestros ingresos económicos es con el trabajo que realizamos en Canadá, me encuentro en apuros económicos para solventar gastos en mi familia.
We cannot imagine ourselves on the street with our kids, having no way to provide them any food.
Los indocumentados, nosotros también somos humanos, nosotros también trabajamos y contribuimos fuertemente a la economía, a nuestro trabajo, nuestra mano de obra, que permite que siga funcionando esta máquina de la economía. Nosotras limpiamos, cuidamos las casas de otras mujeres, las que trabajamos como domésticas, cuidamos niños, ancianos, hacemos limpieza en hospitales, supermercados, trabajamos en los campos, en las fábricas. Nuestra mano de obra se encuentra en todos los sectores de la economía.
Myself and all my coworkers were all laid off. As a result of losing my job and also not qualifying for support because my SIN is expired. I have no idea how I'm going to be able to pay for rent and food.
I still need to eat and live. I believe we also should not be left behind. We contributed to Canada.
我希望得到公平的待遇，我也应该得到政府的紧急救济金。
All migrants in Canada must have income support.
It's really hard for me to believe that migrants like myself and all migrants cannot get support because of a formality like expired social insurance number.
I'm ready to work and ready to do what it takes to be a resident here. That I also include fighting for my rights as a worker, regardless of my status.
It is absolutely urgent that the government immediately extend income support to all workers who have been affected by COVID-19, regardless of their migration status.
So, as you can see, I mean, this is a video that we are premiering tomorrow on all our social media channels. So that's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we are going to send a message to Justin Trudeau from migrant workers to be able to hear them so that they can get healthcare for all, income supports and worker protections, permanent resident status, community supports and rent freeze, and self-determination. If you can take a moment sometime tomorrow after 11 a.m. or to go share these videos, to share these words directly with Prime Minister Trudeau, so that when we talk about food justice, when we talk about climate justice and environmental justice, we can ensure that the people who are the actual essential workers that are keeping this community moving are part of the ones that are getting the necessary income supports and response. So that's all for me. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan. That was incredible. Really appreciate that. And we will put the calls up to action on our channel. So in case anyone missed that, we'll also repeat them later towards the end of the webinar. Next up, we have Cheyenne Sundance.
Hey everyone, really cool to see you and cool to be on this talk. My name is Cheyenne Sundance. I run an urban farm in Toronto that's year-round and is called Sundance Harvest. And I also manage a few other projects. So what Sundance Harvest is, it's a year-round farm, mainly operating in a greenhouse in Downview Park in Toronto, which is really exciting considering I haven't really seen many examples of a year-round farm work in the city. So I'm glad that I can be a part of that. Also, Sundance Harvest grows something beyond food. So it grows food justice and food sovereignty. So in my work growing food, and I started Sundance Harvest, I think 2 years ago. I'm 23, I started when I was like 21, around that time. Sundance Harvest mainly focuses on food sovereignty for Black and Indigenous folks and other racialized and marginalized people like queer folks, trans folks, Two-Spirit, and non-binary peoples. Sundance Harvest does a lot of free educational workshops and webinars now, and also hands-on education for mainly youth who are BIPOC, queer, trans, and Two-Spirit. And I'm really incorporating these marginalized identities because when we're looking at representation in agriculture or even urban agriculture, how often do we have representation of people who look like me running, let's say, urban farms or running a community garden or even running a large rural farm? It's very rare to see representation that looks like me unless we're talking about migrant workers like the previous panelists just spoke about at length. So when we're speaking about Sundance Harvest and kind of like the work that I do and I make Sundance Harvest is I started it because I really wanted to see an urban farm in Toronto be year-round, but also have the ability to teach other young folks who maybe also have the same marginalizations as myself do the same thing. So per year, I mentor about 20 to 25 youth. And when I mentor these youth, I actually mentor them from the start of their project, so the very seed of their project, to the actual harvest of their project, to not be so on the nose. And I'm really happy to say that sometimes these mentorships just even look like them having a career in urban agriculture. It is a rarity to find someone who can have a full-time employment year-round in urban ag. So I'm really happy to provide that opportunity to those youth. Some of the other projects that I mentor are, for example, youth-led community gardens or even Indigenous-led healing gardens. And I grow a lot of these seedlings in my greenhouse and I donated them to several of these projects. So Sundance Harvest does grow produce year-round, have a CSA, and sell at farmers markets. But what I also do is primarily educate, teach, and then also I speak at length about food justice and food sovereignty. So the way I started Sundance Harvest and kind of got into growing food was a bit unorthodox. I moved to Cuba when I was 18 years old, and I lived in a small, kind of like rural area called Viñales. If you've ever knew anything about Cuba, it's a very popular tobacco region. So I learned a lot about tobacco growing, a lot about cabasa root, and also a lot about chickens living in that area. The farm I was living on was a socialist permaculture farm, so they really focused a lot on community building. And then living in that region, I actually learned a lot about peasant farming, the La Viva Campesina movement, where a lot of peasant farmers band together, grow food, and actually stand for their own food sovereignty rights, which I thought was really radical at 18. And I was like, well, maybe I'll be a farmer. So I had the privilege to learn farming and connecting with land in such a way where I felt very supported by community and also by community that looked like me, racialized people, Black humans, Afro-Indigenous folks. I had that opportunity to learn about food growing in that way. And I feel like that food growing journey actually helped molded Sundance Harvest to create what it is today, which is ultimately an urban farm that is for the people and by the people. And I'm very happy to say that I also run like a lower cost farm school, which is basically an opportunity for someone who's interested in urban ag to get education and skills and also mentorship with me. And I do that once a year for about 8 months. And I find that it's really helped kind of mobilize new projects in Toronto. And then the last project I kind of run, so I run Sundance Harvest, I do educational workshops for marginalized youth, farm school, and then the last one is Liberating Lawns. So it's actually a new project that I'll be talking a bit more in this panel about, but it's basically a yard sharing project, and it actually got birthed out of the idea because I noticed during this pandemic that no new spaces were opening up to grow food. When we see like Victoria, for example, which has been really down for the cause for community gardens, opening up new spaces. We can even see closer to home in Brampton, how Brampton, the city of Toronto, the city of Brampton has like a backyard program where they're encouraging you to grow vegetables, giving you compost, delivering it to your door. We don't see really anything happening in Toronto. So I kind of just wanted to take it into my own, I guess, will to do something. So I started Liberating Lawns, which is a yard sharing project, which matches landholders to growers. And by landholders, that doesn't just mean someone with residential backyard space. That means coffee shops with extra yard space. That also means places of worship. It can mean really any places that have a lawn that need to be liberated, ripped up, and put in vegetables. So that's a bit about the projects I do. And that's kind of a bit about who I am.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheyenne. I can't wait to hear more about the Liberating Lawns program. It seems so amazing and so responsive to what's going on. Thank you for sharing all of that. Next up, we have Carolyn. Take it away, Carolyn.
Thank you, Yasim. Ani Bojo, Gwegwe, Asego Tanzi. Welcome. Hello, everyone. First, I want to just thank you all for the invitation to share with you this evening, and wishing you all and your loved ones good health during this time. So my name is Carolyn. I'm a Mi'kmaq woman from the East Coast, known today as Nova Scotia. I also have African and Irish ancestry. I was born in what's known today as Nova Scotia, but most of my life grew up in Toronto. Yet I was very fortunate to grow up with a deep relationship with the land that was deeply fostered and nurtured by my family. You know, unfortunately, I didn't grow up with my traditions due to oppression and colonial ways, but that relationship with land was always embedded in me. And so I would say the first 20 years of my life, I actually did work in service. I worked in mental health for 20 years as a child and youth worker. And what I was seeing in that work constantly was the heavy reliance on pharmaceuticals and seeing a deep disconnection between the youth and the land, as well as the food that they were putting into their bodies. And so with that, I studied holistic nutrition and started to learn about the foods and medicines of the land, as well as changing my course of career and going into food security. So I worked at Food Share Toronto for 10 years. Many of those years I was developing school food gardens and doing nature relation programming with the children or the students, as well as developing curriculum linked workshops. And then the last few years that I was with Food Share was actually the Indigenous Food Access Manager. So working with the remote communities along the James Bay, such as Attawapiskat, Kashachewan, Fort Albany, and Moose Factory. And that project, that partnership was, you know, looking at ways that us as an organization could support the communities, that it be self-determined by the communities, and was there anything that we could do in regards to accessing funding for them. And so it looked very different in each community because it was self-determined. And you know, with that work came a project in the documentary we created called Reckoning with the Wendigo. And I'm a film producer, and it's focusing upon the resiliency of the communities along the James Bay, the Cree communities. And the Wendigo is an entity, that's a story that's told in many nations by different names. of this being that consumes unhuman flesh that is never satisfied. And so when we talk about the title, Reckoning with the Wendigo, we're looking at capitalism, colonialism, that are representing that entity that is continuously feeding on the communities through the continuous oppressive colonial systems that exist today. So when I do this work around food security, food sovereignty, even though I don't work with Food Share, I work with my own business, focusing on work around resiliency, healing, decolonizing, and reconciling with oneself and with others. And a lot of that work is out on the land. And so when I'm thinking about all of that's happening today in regards to the food systems and how it's impacting specifically Indigenous communities, I don't speak for every Indigenous community, and that's really important for me to convey that. And nor am I an expert. There are many people that have knowledge amongst the communities, so I want to also acknowledge that as well. So during my, when I'm thinking about today, we can see that this pandemic has revealed more so to the masses the dysfunction of the systems that are in place today and the many gaps that are happening. And 1 in 2 Indigenous families, homes are food insecure. That's a high statistic when we think about it, 1 out of 2 families. And so when we're thinking about a pandemic, it only exacerbates what's happening already in the communities, especially in remote communities. And when we're thinking about, the Northwest company that operates in many of the remote communities, that is a US-based company that was kind of birthed out of the Hudson Bay Company in some kind of informal way, but has no affiliation with it to this day. And when we look at that Northwest Company, the high cost of food in the communities, when we know, as when I worked at Food Share, when we could transport food up into the northern communities, it cost about 1/4 of what the northern stores were charging the communities. And for a community, a family of 4, it cost them about $500 every few days to feed a family of 4. So when we're thinking about that, the disparities that Indigenous communities are facing, with the lack of clean water, a lack of decent healthcare in the communities, as well as lack of equal access to education and so forth. It's very problematic. And when we think about all the land that's designated as reserves for Indigenous communities, it's 0.2% of all the land in Canada. And so that means 98.8% of the remaining land of what's known today as Canada is being controlled by non-Indigenous people. And so just to put that in perspective, there are 22 reservations in Arizona. And the Navajo Reservation, which is the largest reservation in the United States, actually has the Hopi Reservation within it. You could take all the land that's designated for Indigenous people, that's considered reserves, and you can actually fit it within that Hopi Reservation that's within the Navajo Reservation, which is 2 of 22 reservations in that state alone. And when we're thinking about this crisis, the Navajo people are actually experiencing a higher rate of this virus. I think it's 10 times higher of Indigenous people that are being infected by the virus in the state of Arizona compared to non-Indigenous people in that state at this time. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, if I'm okay, or if I need to. I haven't actually been checking the timing for myself. You could show me, Yasim, with a few minutes, like on your fingers. Okay, great, just so I can wrap up. So just thinking around this, the work that I'm very passionate about is, ensuring that our our systems are more just, that they're equally just, that they're equitable, and that we know historically that when you control the food, then it's easier to control the people. And that has been a reoccurring throughout history. When food has been used, has been weaponized. And we can see that happening in Indigenous communities historically. And so as Indigenous people that are still practicing those ways of, hunting and fishing and gathering from the land, being in that relationship with the land is so important. And so to think about, for many of us who are in the urban centers with this lockdown, how challenging it is, not to be able to go out and do our ceremonies with our people, with our communities, having that separation once again from having access to the land during this time when it's so important. So thank you. That's all I have to say for this moment.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for all of that important insight and information about Indigenous communities all throughout North America. We really appreciate that. And thanks for reiterating that you're not speaking for all Indigenous communities, but the ones that you particularly spoke about and have spent time in working in. So now I'm gonna ask each of the panelists some questions, and eventually after a little while we'll open it up and we'll be having some more questions coming from all of you who are tuned in. And I just wanted to say thank you everyone for tuning in. So we know that in this pandemic, society's most vulnerable groups are the ones suffering the worst impacts, during the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic shock. They're also climate vulnerable and food insecure. And so, for example, low income communities have the fewest resources to weather the crisis of any kind. So people who may have been moderately food insecure are risking becoming severely food insecure. People who are living without housing, who are dependent on shelters and food programs, are even more vulnerable, as many programs and shelters may not be operating at full capacity, as they are putting in place some social distancing policies and leaving too many people to fend for themselves. So we also know that the right to food is a fundamental human right. It is enshrined in a range of international legal instruments, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. And it is more specifically spelled out in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which Canada signed in 1976. So it is included in various other human rights instruments, and Canada has a legal obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to food. So let's tease this out in more practical terms. Let's now turn to the farmers, to migrant farm workers, and to Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge keepers, who are all essential to our food system as food producers, growers, and leaders of communities and knowledge keepers. And so I'm gonna start off by asking Hassan, and you answered some of this, so I'd ask you to elaborate on any part you feel you didn't get a chance to touch on. How has the pandemic exacerbated the already challenging situations for migrant workers? I know that you did touch on this, so you might want to just reiterate some parts or talk about a particular issue that you would like to flesh out.
I think we need to start from the beginning. So the COVID-19 pandemic is, of course, impacting the poorest people around the world, and most of them are not in North America and not in Canada. And the first thing is that we have to be aware of and cognizant of, and that so for migrants, I mean, that's where our families are. So when we talk about how is it impacting migrants, it's impacting our families back home in that way. But then when we talk about in the context of Canada, I mean, it's everything. So who are the people who are not able to stay at home and shelter in place? Who are the people who are forced to go out and be domestic workers or cleaners or agricultural workers or delivery workers? It's people who do not have income support or who are in bad jobs but can't leave them, because if you leave a job right now voluntarily, the government will deny you all income supports. And all of those or many of those are migrants. So just to give you a couple of stories. We have migrant workers who are undocumented. You saw them in the video, who are, essentially saying, if COVID-19 doesn't kill us, hunger will, because we don't have jobs and we don't have income support. We have members who are migrant care workers whose employers are refusing to let them leave the house. Leave the house to send money home to their families, leave the house to get cell phone, leave the house to get groceries, because they're treating migrants as if they're carriers. Third, as you can see, in most of the situations where the largest outbreaks are taking place, it is in factories and workplaces which are predominantly migrant workers. Why? Because those workers can't assert their right to safe and dignified work. And why can't they? Because of immigration and provincial laws that exclude them. So if we look at outside of long-term care homes, that's where the biggest outbreak is. But the economic challenge that we are facing is people are facing irreversible catastrophe. If you lose a payment for your rent today, or if you lose your car payment, then if you cannot get that life-saving surgery because you simply don't have money, your life is permanently altered. We have people who are calling us saying, we can't send money home, which means there will be no roof in our homes for the rainy season, which means all our material possessions we've collected for the last 30, 40 years will be gone. People, we have families who've given birth at home without any preparation, without a midwife, just alone because they had no other choice. But in that moment, because they couldn't afford hospitals, because as you know, there is no universal health care. We have members who simply can't feed themselves. We are facing a situation of abject despair that is being exacerbated by this crisis, and nothing short of dealing with the entirety. You know, people say, let's return to normal. We have no interest in normal. Normal was bad. Normal was the slow death. Now we are in the fast death.
Thank you so much, Hasan. So now I'm going to ask Cheyenne, how has the pandemic exacerbated already challenging situations for urban farmers? And could you also include within this question how the closing of farmers markets and also community gardens may have changes to the scheduling policies in the farmers markets have impacted you as a farmer?
Yeah, so I would say the way COVID-19 has affected farmers and also urban farmers in general, the first largely thing most of us notice, and you probably have heard it in the news or from friends, is the lack of seed. So there's been an issue with a lot of my friends who, let's say, have bought their seed later in the season, and I usually buy my seed every 2 months because I farm year round. If a farmer were to buy their seed now, they wouldn't be able to buy seed, because simply the seed stock is, most of it's out. There's back orders up until June for some like large seed companies or small seed companies. So really the lack of seed is something that a lot of people are getting worried about, and a lot of my small farmer friends are a bit worried about right now, and I'm mailing out some seed to them actually quite soon. So I would say that's one of the biggest thing I noticed. And I think that seeing that really shines a light on what is seed sovereignty and how are we creating a local resilient community with seeds. Like, are we trading our seeds? Are we saving seeds? Are we encouraging people to learn about seed saving? Or are we relying on a few seed companies to produce those seeds, which is perfectly fine. I'm very down for the cause for supporting local seed companies, but I also think that it's a very crucial skill to learn. But I would say that the close of the farmers markets also have been affecting farmers a lot too. For example, I'm very lucky that my main farmers market, Dufferin Grove, has actually shifted online. So right now, most farmers markets are doing is they're understanding that farmers like me have a livelihood to make with our produce. And if I didn't get the chance to sell my produce, I simply just wouldn't have money to buy groceries or pay rent. So what they're doing is most farmers markets is creating an online portal or virtual market where they can actually have orders be picked up at a different location. And I find this has helped a lot. However, not all farmers markets are doing this. So I find that the closing of farmers markets are actually hurting a lot of growers as well. And to say it's a bit different selling your produce online than it is in person. There's an active community at farmers markets, right? I remember my first winter market, I had such a good time because I made a lot of cool friends, and a lot of the locals were like, oh, these are local, hyper-local greens. These are great. And there's that feeling of you're in something. So it does feel a bit distant because everything's online. And I'm just, for example, today I just dropped off some greens for the Dufferin Grove farmers market, and I felt a bit distant just dropping it off, having to leave immediately. But I would say with the community gardens, it's really hurts a lot of urban farmers too. And urban farming takes place in the city. Sometimes it's just at one plot, like a large farm like Black Creek Community Farm or Food Share, but then some other small urban farmers have multiple plots, and that's called spin farming. So some folks who are doing spin farming are actually affected because they're having an issue of maybe getting into their allotment garden, or maybe the resident is not allowing them to use a backyard anymore. So there's that also issue as well. And I feel like that issue one of the ways it can be solved is actually having designated green space for farming in Toronto. There's so few designated urban farms. When I say urban farms, I don't mean community gardens or allotment gardens that the city basically dictates when they can open and close, which in my opinion is not food sovereignty. That is a very harsh process that they're taking and giving from us. But urban farms are something like Black Creek Farms, Food Share School Grown Garden. These spots are designated for the community, by the community, and it has healthy, affordable food that's also culturally relevant. So I haven't really seen many of those, and I feel like the fact that the community gardens are still closed, even though the Ontario government just deemed them as an essential service, really speaks to the lack of need the city feels like to do anything with urban ag and to actually see it as an essential service for food security. So I feel really bad for those who are growing food in the city as gardeners or farmers, considering that we live in small spots, and maybe we don't have a yard, we have a balcony or something like that. And I just can't imagine not being able to grow your own food. I truly believe food and land are the basis of all liberation. So if someone has a community garden plot or allotment garden plot that's taken away from them, really what is that doing to their own sovereignty and food security? So I would say it's been a bit hard for farmers regarding seeds. And then also, I feel like it's really shined a light on the kind of cracks in the urban food movements and the urban agriculture movements about how many spaces are really for community.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne. And so Carolyn, I wanted to ask you a similar question, which you spoke to a bit in your intro, but I wanted to know if you could elaborate on how has this pandemic exacerbated already challenging situations for Indigenous communities, specifically related to food?
Okay, sure. Well, when we're thinking about the inequities that occur, that exist today in Canada, there's supposed to be, the human rights so that everyone should have equal access to housing, clean water, and so forth, education, healthcare. And we could see that, like I mentioned, there are those disparities because Indigenous communities lack in those services. And so when we're thinking about this pandemic and the food crisis, it's, there's already discussion around the cost of food increasing because of meat, packaging, factories having to shut down and so forth, and how that's going to increase the cost of food. And we already know, as I mentioned, that in many of these northern communities, the cost of food is already extremely high. And so for people to be further insecure is very problematic. And when we're thinking about the community at Saskatchewan, that community, they were forced in that land, which is low-lying land that floods every spring. And so they have to always be relocated for many months during this time. And so there's lots of concern in the community when we're thinking about this virus and relocating to areas, because in the communities this pandemic is just showing how much more vulnerable Indigenous people are when we look at the higher rates of diabetes and heart disease amongst the community members. So there's a lot of concern about the community members from Saskatchewan having to be relocated to the south and having that exposure. And so the government hasn't really put anything in place. We can see that has just kind of exacerbated the situation that's happening there when we think about the virus, relocation, and then even the higher cost of food as well. The other thing I would say too is in regards to food, when I was working up in the northern communities, there was a great desire for the communities to stop the reliance of food and goods from the south, because they're very well aware of that dependency, and that if something were to disrupt that system in the south, how it would impact them in the north. And that's evident today, where even having access to certain products or are not as possible because some of those products aren't even going up to the northern communities. So when we think about hand sanitizers and masks and gloves, when we're thinking about pandemic, but when we're talking about the situation around food and the resiliency and the desire to hold on to traditional ways of hunting and fishing and gathering from the land is even more evident in the northern communities because of, being prepared for something like this. And we could see that, even communities shutting their doors during this crisis to prevent a spread in their communities as well, but how that impacts the flow of goods into the community as well is problematic because a lot of the community members get their goods, they rely on going on those ice roads during the winter and going down into southern communities such as Timmins, for example, to be able to purchase their food because it's a lot cheaper to go to Timmins and make the drive down on the ice road than it is to actually go to the northern store in their community. But with the lockdown and the shutdown of this province, that made it even more challenging. And so just more disparities around access to food in the communities.
Thanks so much. This next question is for Hasan. So I just wanted to ask you, how have federal and provincial governments, the initiatives by the government, attempts to make or change these policies to ensure that migrant workers can still come to Canada have fallen short? And I know that you touched on this a bit, so I just wanted to know if you could elaborate.
Right, so let's start from the top, right? So when we talk about universal healthcare today, only 2 out of the 13 provinces and territories, so that's Ontario and Quebec, have said that COVID-19 related testing and treatment would be available to all migrant and undocumented people regardless of status. That's the very basic, but the other regions still have not, and the federal government has done almost nothing to make it so. When we talk about income supports, right now, the vast majority of people with no social insurance numbers or expired social insurance numbers, and that's a lot of people because to renew your social insurance number, I'm not even sure people know this, but your social insurance number for a migrant expires along with your work permit or your study permit. Around April, many students and others are trying to renew their work or study permits, but there's a backlog because of COVID-19, so there's no processing possible. Without renewing that, you can't renew your social insurance number, so it's a technicality. Hundreds of thousands of people don't have valid social insurance numbers. This also includes undocumented people, people with no status. That's 500,000 people at least. Then we talk about paid sick days. We talk about the fact that people can't assert their right to a safe work. So if they're in situations where they can't walk away because there's no social distancing possible, they can't because their employer tied work permits, as I explained. When we talk about community supports, I mean, even the most basic, there are lots of food banks who are choosing to turn to increase their ID requirements in this moment because they are seeing an overwhelming demand to try and ensure that it's people just from their area or that there isn't so-called double dipping. For a lot of migrant and undocumented people, they don't have those IDs, so they're not accessing those food banks. So at every turn, whether it's federal government, provincial government, municipal, even local agencies are failing migrant and undocumented people. However, when you see what happened in Ontario and in Quebec where healthcare is available, that's because migrants organized and fought back and won. When we talk about the fact that income supports initially was actually going to be only for citizens, but we organized and we said it has to be for residents, which is a huge difference. So now if you have a valid social insurance number, even if you don't have PR, you can access it. So where we have seen changes, it has been a direct result of migrants putting themselves in danger and speaking out, such as this video where these workers, as you can see, are choosing to be unmasked. They don't have immigration papers, they could be detained, they can face deportation, but they're choosing not to. In another case, in an immigration detention center, migrants went on hunger strike in prison for 8 days before they started releasing them from prison. Because as we all know, prisons are one of the places where COVID-19 outbreaks are the most because of the lack of basic supports for people in prison. So at every turn, migrants are organizing and making changes, and the federal and provincial government is being forced to do so, which is why I urge people to join us tomorrow in sharing our video through our social media channels.
Thank you so much, Hassan, for talking about that, the important work that migrant workers are doing to change their own situation and to transform the situation for themselves, and how whatever the government's doing is in response to the work that they're doing, the struggle that they're pushing forward, and the important points about how many migrant workers are being held in detention centers and how prisons and detention centers are some of the worst places for outbreaks. Thank you for shining a light on that. Next question is for Cheyenne. I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about how any programs or policies by the government have either assisted or hindered urban farmers in your ability to grow food. And I think you touched on this a little bit before, and maybe you want to flesh this out within the question about food sovereignty. You were talking about how community gardens are not food sovereignty, because the government actually controls when people can access these and when they cannot. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, cool. So I would say that there has been no support, whether that be policies or any other implements from the government that's actually helped food sovereignty or food security. So it even started at the beginning. The governments of Ontario and the City of Toronto did not deem community gardens, food growing spots, or allotment gardens as an essential service. This is in contrast to many other cities that have done that from the very beginning. And that shows how clearly they see what urban agriculture is. The way it was framed was as a hobby, that it was a kind of a fun thing to do, maybe a distressor. Sure, it can be all of that, but urban agriculture to marginalized communities who live in the city and don't have the intergenerational wealth and privilege of a farm up in Milton, then they don't have the opportunity to grow food anywhere else. So if you are in the city, you're landlocked, you can't really go anywhere, not having the availability to grow food is, my opinion, is against the human right of growing food. So I would say that the City of Toronto and all the Ontario government as a whole themselves did not implement any policies. If anything, it actually hindered food security and food sovereignty movements. If people, for example, cannot go to the garden center to even get seedlings, there's no availability of seedlings right now. And many people are messaging me for my seedlings. And it hurts me to say that I can't actually give it to them because I need to grow food in my greenhouse for like my community. But I have been trying to donate my seedlings. So if garden centers and nurseries or other places where folks get seedlings for their community gardens are closed, really where are these folks going to actually get their starts for the season? So that's something I've noticed as well too. So I would say that also having community gardens finally deemed an essential service in Ontario didn't actually happen overnight. It actually happened with lobbying and work done by people like myself, Rhonda from Tug, Food Share, Black Creek Farms, and some other great folks as well. We worked so hard to actually get public health, especially Rhonda from Tug. She's done a lot of work with lobbying for that. So it was a fight. We actually had to put up a fight to get the Ontario government and the City of Toronto to see that, hey, we actually need food growing in the city for our own food sovereignty and food security. So we had to push for that. And this is to say that coming from the City of Toronto, which doesn't really have any urban agriculture policy, and the last big implement was in 2010 with the Grow TO Action Plan. It's been about a decade. We don't have chickens. We don't have a lot of bees going on. We hardly have any large-scale urban farms in the city. Maybe we have a couple on our hands. And compared to cities like Seattle or Vancouver or California or New York, they have kind of the same density. Why don't we have a lot of these implements? And why is it being so difficult for community groups and people and organizations and nonprofits and just folks like myself who's running a pretty small urban farm having to push for this basic necessity of food, land, and life? I just did not understand that. And I feel like that speaks very clearly about the lack of need that the city sees for this, and there hasn't really been any policy to support the work I've been doing. For example, like Sundance Harvest is completely self-funded. I don't accept really any federal grants or any other support for the work I do. And for a long time, when the community gardens were closed, I've actually been getting a lot of emails from folks telling me, where can I grow my tomatoes? I started my seedlings indoors. I've invested in grow lights. I bought all this potting soil. And these are folks that don't really do gardening as a hobby. They do it as a thing to actually grow food for food security. And that's why I started a yard sharing project, because I truly did not see the city was going to do anything to open up more green space. So if I couldn't find any green space, I was just going to try to work, I guess, behind the scenes to open up residential lawns to give people an opportunity to grow that food. Because community gardens in Toronto have over 1,000 people on wait lists. They're really not going to be opening up anymore anytime soon. And that's why I've said before, and I will say again, that community gardens are not food sovereignty. Food sovereignty, if you think about levels, food security is like level 1, but food sovereignty is like the final level. Food security is food banks. It's basically having food. I was quite food insecure as a kid. Just having Wonder Bread and sardines, that was great because it makes my belly full and I get to go to school. But having food sovereignty is having control over the food system, control over the seed sovereignty, and also control over the distribution. So who gets the food, how, where, what communities, do remote communities get that food? If so, how much does it cost? That is what food sovereignty is. Food sovereignty is not the city of Toronto locking up community gardens, restricting that food sovereignty and restricting people having the ability to make their own choices about how to grow their food, when, what type of culturally relevant food they can grow. So I truly think that it was an attack on food sovereignty to close those gardens. And I'm very happy that hopefully they'll open up. But I truly do think that community gardens will never be an answer to food sovereignty because who's controlling it at the end of the day?
Thank you so much, Cheyenne. That was great. So Carolyn, I wanted to ask you, I know that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk from the federal government about how they were going to be assisting Indigenous communities during the pandemic. And I was just wondering if you think, like, how have these federal and provincial governments, you know, any policies that they've made regarding the pandemic, have they fallen short? Or how are they, you know, impacting Indigenous communities? Are they doing a positive, or are they doing a good job? Is it helping with any kind of food security, or is it exacerbating the problem?
Yeah, so I would say to start with, when we're thinking about the lockdown that the government issued provincially, and, you know, and the restrictions that were put onto the general public for the safety and the well-being of everybody in community. The question is, how does business as usual continue with the construction of the pipeline? You know, when we think about the Wet'suwet'en, who are unable to sit in negotiations with their community members because they cannot gather more than 5 people, but yet there could be hundreds of workers at any of these camps. So construction of oil, gas, pipelines, and hydroelectric dams, all that construction is still continuing on Indigenous land. And even where there's supposed to be negotiations happening, when we think about the Wet'suwet'en, they're upholding their part by abiding by the restrictions, yet the RCMP still has a presence on the community and construction continues. And we can see that even happening further south with the Keystone Pipeline. So when I think about just in general around the policies, you know, that's a little bit different in regards to, from a different perspective and how that's impacting it. And so I just realized, oh, pardon me. And so also just kind of thinking about the infrastructure in Indigenous communities and how problematic it is. You know, the government allocated, it was like over $300 billion to Indigenous communities. And even Indigenous leaders amongst these communities have asked, how will this help urban Indigenous people that aren't connected to the reserve? When we think about people who are non-status, will a woman in an urban setting get the same amount of funding as a woman who's on a reserve as far as Indigenous women? So there's a lot of gaps around the funding around that. And even just with the processes of applying for these funds can be very challenging as well, especially in northern communities where internet or Wi-Fi is spotty at most times, and then even trying to make phone calls can be very challenging during those times with long waits. So when we're thinking about the infrastructure of Indigenous communities, those disparities are even more evident today. And so when we're thinking about the money that is allocated, and Indigenous leaders welcoming it, but they still say that it's going to still fall short to be able to effectively support everyone. And the question I have too is back in 2017, the parliamentary budget officer had calculated a minimum cost of $3.2 billion to bring on-reserve water systems up to the same standards as Canadian communities. Only $3.2 billion. And yet there are Indigenous communities all across Canada for many decades that have been without access to clean drinking water. And so we could see that money could be funneled into an economy to try to restart economy, or whether it's bailouts in the future. You know, it's just evident to see the continual racist, oppressive systems that are in place and the inequities that are still occurring with these policies. So I think it's really important for you know, the people that are communicating with Indigenous members to ensure that, you know, hereditary chiefs are also included in those conversations as well, because, you know, there's a lot of problems with the Indian Act and, you know, chief and council and band on council. And so when we're looking at the infrastructure and bringing in funding, and it's a very complicated thing, much more complicated to get into this situation right now. There's just many challenges to ensure that the people who really need it get that funding.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thanks for mentioning how problematic the Indian Act is and how there's that contention between the hereditary chiefs and the band chiefs and council. So now we're going to move on to all of you who have been tuned in. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in, hearing that there's a lot of people tuned in, and that's really awesome. So I just want to thank you all for taking time to do that. And I wanted to start sharing some questions. So with all of you panelists, so I would ask all of you to turn your video on, and then there's going to be lots of different questions. So the first one is coming from Kathleen from Toronto. It says, what are the names of local farmers that do online order delivery service that we can support? I personally want to know about those in the Greater Toronto area. Cheyenne, I'm going to direct this question to you. Maybe you have a website or somewhere where folks could go.
Yeah, so I would say that for delivery, a few farms are doing their own delivery. And these are mainly like the larger scale farms that have like the infrastructure to do their own delivery. So I'd recommend, as a base of just finding out farms that maybe that you have a passion for, because each farm has a kind of like a mission, that to go to a farmer's market website. So like the Dufferin Grove Farmers Market, for example, that's where to get my produce. It's really tasty, it's really great. And in the Dufferin Grove Farmers Market, you can actually pick up. So you can actually go to their Dundas West and Gladstone location where they're doing the pickup, or you can get delivery, which is really great because it's contactless and they actually deliver by bicycle. So that's super cool. But if you're not in the Dufferin Grove kind of area of Toronto, that's cool. You can also see the other farmers markets. So like Witchwood Market or Sororan, most of these markets have actually uploaded on their website or social media where to actually get produce from farmers. So I'd recommend that. I can't really maybe give any like exact recommendations right now because I'm kind of like one of the lone or year-round farmers in Toronto. So I don't really know many of the rural farmers as much. So I'd recommend the basis of finding some CSA boxes or somewhere to buy bulk produce. Try to find out the farmers market's website and look on that a bit. But you can get mine at Dufferin Grove.
And I just wanted to make sure also, thank you so much, Cheyenne. I just wanted to make sure we have people that are tuned in from all over the country. So I know that while we're in Toronto, I want to make sure that we're inclusive of everyone. So if any of the other panelists have suggestions of for any of the questions, if you want to chime in, please feel free. I might direct it at a particular panelist, but please feel free to chime in. If you have some information about great places to, for people to be getting deliveries from urban farmers in other parts of the country, any one of you, please share, okay? So the next question is from Sabat Ismail to Cheyenne. Could you talk a bit more about your beliefs on land and food being the basis of liberation?
Yeah, so I feel like my ideas regarding that was really implemented when I was living in Cuba, a bit off the grid, and kind of learning about how the peasant farmers in Cuba, and peasant farming is kind of a term that's largely used in South America, like especially with the Viva la Campesina movement of farmers banding together and understanding that we are the workers, we do have rights, and our labor is valuable. So I feel like the whole me believing food and land is the basis of liberation was really built up by seeing peasant farmers in rural Cuba growing grain, growing tobacco, growing cavassa root, growing these bulk staples that they can trade and have amongst their communities. So I would say that my basis on food and land as liberation and freedom also comes from the fact that if you are having your own food sovereignty, that also means that you have the ability to grow food and you have the ability to actually be on land that you feel you can grow food on, and also protect that land and have that land feel protected by you. So I would say, speaking a bit further on that, also, and a different lens is that, for example, the Black Panthers would always say that, especially considering that their political leanings were kind of counter to what America was at the time. And if someone is revolutionizing and working against an oppressive cause, without having your own food source, and also without having your own accessibility to maybe water and also protein and meat and everything you need, how are you really going to band together and work toward revolution? And that's speaking on maybe a broader term, but that's something that I've been taught from, I guess, since I was 18 about when I grow food, why am I growing food, and who is it for? So I think food and land is the basis of all liberation, because no revolution and no front can be fought without people having a full stomach. And that might be like a little funny thing to say, but it is true. And people need to be sustained, and communities need to be sustained. And real community work can happen when people feel like they're nurtured and they feel nourished. So I would say that points to what that question is.
Awesome. The next question I see here is from Deborah Barnt, and that's to Carolyn. And it says, can you speak to the possibilities of forest gardening, both rural and urban, and what we can learn from Indigenous peoples about food beyond the field?
Yes, so, when I worked in food security for 10 years, the one thing that I noticed that was missing in all the activism that was happening was relationship with the land, right? For many people, right? There are many people that have a relationship with the land, but in general, it was all about a focus of accessing land to be able to grow food for that right. But the relationship piece was never a part of it. And to have an understanding of all the beings that are connected to that place, that are connected to our food system. And so what Haudenosaunee elders have always shared with me is the importance of gratitude, and to be thankful every single day and to greet that day with that gratitude. And when thinking about growing food, there would be many times that I would hear from many other growers complain about, maybe the squirrels biting into the best tomatoes or whatever it might be, as if there was a conspiracy happening amongst the squirrels in the area. And, or also having conflict with certain insects that have been labeled as pests, or the plants that are coming out that haven't been intentionally planted there, being labeled as weeds. And so the one thing, as a Mi'kmaq woman, is we talk about that relationship with the land, that we see the land as a relative, all those beings, and we treat the land with as much respect, with as much love as we do with our human relatives. And that's so important when we think about growing food. Just like Cheyenne was mentioning earlier, she talks about that relationship when she's growing food, because we are from the land, we are part of the land always. And, we, for tens of thousands or since millennia, the earth has always provided everything that we have needed to survive. And when we're thinking about how do we find a way to go back into that relationship? How do we return home to that relationship? Because it's in all of us. All of our ancestors at one point in time in history had a deep relationship with the land. And it's really important for people to remember that. Because when we have that relationship, that intimacy, just as we have that intimacy with our loved ones, we would do whatever it takes to protect our loved ones. And if we have that same intimacy, respect, and love for the land that we're connected to when we're growing our food, harvesting our food, wherever it might be, that we are going to stand up and be willing to protect that land just as we would our loved ones. And that's so important today, as we see all across the earth, the land being poisoned, so much extraction. Even when we hear the word resource, it's a very colonial way of referencing those beings. It's about taking away. There's no reciprocity. There's no giving back in that language. And so how do we decolonize our interactions with the land? And how do we indigenize or return back home to that first relationship that all of us had at one point in time? And it's really important, not only for the well-being of ourselves, but also for the well-being of the land, because we are getting our food and our medicine from the land. It's important that we need to take care of her, to respect her.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. The next question is for Hassan. It's from Gabriela Lech. It says, what can we do to support migrant workers at this time?
So the first thing that everyone can do is go to our website, migrantrights.ca/COVID-19, and sign up petition. And then the second thing that you can do is that you can go and share this video that I shared with you on your social media channels tomorrow and tag Prime Minister Trudeau. That's something everybody can do. And I think that's really, really important. Tomorrow's May Day. It's the International Workers' Day. And it's a day where we really want to be raising our voices and make sure that the Prime Minister can hear us, particularly on this demand around income supports, but also in general around healthcare, immigration rights, access to basic food, rent, social services, and worker rights and protections. So those are the top two things that I would encourage everybody else to do. And after that, I mean, really strongly encourage people to organize. Look, we cannot change everything unless we are actually in organizations. It's not enough to sign petitions. We need to go to meetings. We need to meet with people like ourselves who can work with us, to challenge us, to make us be able to shape our political thinking and to build political alliances and actually move the struggle forward. The most important thing each of us needs to do is to be an active member of an organization that meets regularly, that is taking on one part of the struggle. We are up against 2,000 people who have more wealth and power than a bottom third of the society. If we are going to be able to get the power back from them, it will need to be hundreds and thousands and millions of us moving together in step, in formation, connected, and in joint struggle, having done the work on ourselves and being able to put our lives and our livelihoods and our futures potentially at risk. That's what it will take. And I think so that's what we need to do. We need to change everything. We can't just solve the issue on migrant justice or food or climate or women's rights or anti-racism or poverty. These are interconnected issues. We can't talk about any of this without, of course, making decolonization the central part of the struggle. And that means actually land back, not just, anything else. But that's where it needs to begin. So we need to unite our struggles, organize ourselves, do the work on ourselves, and be prepared to actually go the distance that it will take. We are talking about transforming everything, and we need to act like it.
Thank you so much. I think Carolyn just wanted to elaborate a little bit on the question before. So go ahead, Carolyn.
Thanks, Yassim. Sorry, I'm actually going to be very transparent. I'm having a hot flash and I got a bit distracted. And that's just kind of happening as I transition in my life. So the one thing I wanted to suggest is when someone was asking the question about the forest gardening and connecting and all that. And I kind of touched upon it, and I was saying about gratitude. The one thing that I implemented in the work that I was doing with the students, with the school food gardens and so forth, was inviting people to the youth finding a way to give thanks, to give something back. to the garden. And it wasn't just about taking from the garden, but to have really a conscious awareness of, being with those plants before, and then, when harvesting, having that feeling of gratitude in whatever way, or showing that, expressing it. And that's something that we can do every day. We could think about that, because gratitude is universal. Whether someone's religious or spiritual or atheist, we can all have gratitude. And we know that there's much benefit in having that gratitude, to be able to think about those tiniest things that we could be thankful for, especially when we think about our food and think about all those beings that are connected to the food that we're about to eat or about to harvest. The other thing is, I mentioned about developing an intimate relationship with the land. And one way of doing that is going out to the land. Maybe it's to the garden, if you have access to growing, or maybe it's, maybe on your balcony, or just looking out a window, or whatever it might be during these times. But, if you get a chance to go to a place, and you go to that same place, and you are there for at least 20 minutes, and you just notice with all of your senses what's happening on the land. And you go at different times of day, if you're going outside in different types of weather, just to get an idea, to become familiar with the land. Because in order for humans to become familiar with each other, we have to spend time with one another. It's the only way. I cannot know any of you by just reading your resume. I actually have to spend quality time to get to know you, to be able to recognize your scent, to recognize the sound of your voice, and so forth. And so the only way we can do that is by spending time with the land, to understand, to start hearing the language that she is speaking to us always. Because as I said, our ancestors understood that language. And so doing that can help us to be in deeper relationship with the land. And, if we're thinking about those plants that are growing in the garden, if we are those earth workers, if those plants are coming up that weren't intentional, that are, have been labeled as weeds or invasive, or whatever name that's given to them, maybe there's a way we can remove those plants in a good way, with a good heart. Maybe we can learn a little bit about those plants before just yanking them out, so violently. Maybe we can think about, where do these plants come from? What were the medicines or the food that these plants offered, or the utilitarian role? Or because all plants have a role, whether they're fixing the soil or providing food or medicine, whatever it might be. And so that's one other way to be able to honor the land, especially when we're thinking about growing food. So I just wanted to share those few things. So thank you, Nassim.
Oh, thank you so much. That was great. Thanks so much for letting me know. So a few folks have brought up this point tonight, and I just wanted to know, they say, can you speak to the difficulty around someone who maybe wants to plant their own garden, but cannot afford property that has enough space to do it? How can cities address this issue and ensure everyone is able to experience food sovereignty?
I can maybe start a few people. Yeah, okay, cool, awesome. So yeah, that's a really great and valid question. So when I'm hearing that question, I'm thinking of a few things. I'm thinking of, yes, a lot of people in the city, for example, of Toronto, where I reside right now, want to grow food, but simply can't, because let's say they can't afford to buy property, or they don't even have a backyard. So really thinking about opportunities and options from that point. So if you're daydreaming, and I'm a really big believer of like daydreaming and staring at the clouds and thinking about what you want, and that's kind of how I started Sundance Harvest, is what I would say is having community urban owned farms. So for example, Black Creek Community Farms, that's a community urban farm that is supported by the community and for the community. And these urban farms give folks like allotment spots and spots to grow, and kind of builds those communities in the same farm. So I would say if folks don't have space right now, thinking about what are your options, your avenues, you have a few choices. You have yard sharing, so growing food in the back of someone's yard, making an agreement, and that's what my project Liberating Lawns in Toronto does. It's a totally free yard sharing project to match up grower and landholder. And then your other options could be trying to join an existing urban farm in your neighborhood, but that's a very hard thing to find, right? Most folks who would just go up to an urban farm and say, hey, can I have land to grow food? The urban farm might just say, we don't actually have enough space, or we're using it for programming. So then you have a third option, an option that is a bit hard, but also is kind of doable, which is start your own urban farm. start your own community-led urban farm. Find out how to get that started, whether that be on like privately owned land, and considering I'm saying that in quotation marks because we are on stolen indigenous land. Also, maybe figuring out if you have a leased option. Like for my greenhouse, I don't own it because I can't own something like that. But instead, I actually get it leased, and I lease it for about a year, and then I can grow food year round. So that's another option. But a lot of, for example, urban farms are on land that is maybe not owned by municipality. Maybe that's owned by a conservation authority like the TRCA, or that could also maybe be owned by like Hydro One. So oftentimes urban farms are created on privatized land. So that's what I would say. But one of the easiest ways to get started is honestly yard sharing. And I feel like that's a good idea considering when you're starting to grow food, it's a big hurdle, kind of getting to know the soil you're working with and the land you're working with, and also how to grow food in general. I feel like it's a very fun thing to think about. It's like, yeah, anyone can grow food, but it takes a lot of different pieces. Like when I started farming, it was so hard. And it took me about 2 years to get really good at it. And even now I'm like, carrots. So I would say that for you, anyone who's listening to this, start small and start with a backyard or a yard. And then if you have the skills, the confidence, and also the community rallying behind you, then lobby to your city councilors for more green space devoted to urban agriculture, and also try to maybe start a community-owned urban farm. I feel like that's just like the dream.
Thanks so much. The next question I wanted to ask is focused for Hassan. And it's mostly about how during this pandemic, a light has really been shone on the conditions, the situation of migrant farm workers. And we are realizing more than ever, like how critical migrant farm workers are to us, important to eat, important to our food system. And so I was wondering, this is more of like sort of a revolutionary question, but if you think that because this is in the forefront of everyone's mind, because people are like going grocery shopping is really the only outing people have, right? Like when you go and you think about it, we're way more intentional about it because we have to like wash everything when we bring it home. And so I was wondering if you think that now that this is in the forefront of everyone's mind, if this is a real opportunity to make hugely significant changes that have been long overdue.
I think it's very important for people to know that we are already seeing attempts from the richest few, the people at the top, to try and take back whatever little gains we have made. So in the last few days, if you pick up the Financial Post, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, you'll see a series of news articles from corporations, and there are many lobbyists and there are many academics saying we need to curb the syrup. We need to cut back on the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. We need to take away, maybe too many people are getting healthcare, maybe too many, like this, the current ban on eviction that exists in a few provinces, not all, needs to be taken away. There are too many people have too many good things happening, which is very, very little, and we know it's not enough. So we have to be prepared. We saw this in 2008. When governments do a massive bailout of corporations, we've just seen billions of dollars, and billions is a lot of money, going to wage subsidies for corporations, to big businesses, to oil and gas pipelines, as was just mentioned, that they will come after us afterwards. After 2008, we saw this, we need to tighten our belts. We're all in this together. We need to save ourselves. Everyone needs to, you got those savings, remember, because this crisis now you have to pay, and they're going to try to transform society in the worst possible image. They're going to be like, oh, we don't have to, you can just work from your home. We can just do online classes. Parents can just teach their kids at home. So they just have to, so we can fire off more healthcare workers. We can fire off more teachers. So there is an onslaught coming against us, right? And so at the same time, it is important that we be organized personally, individually, theoretically, stay at home, but don't stay silent. We will be able to, keep some of the gains that we have. We have seen who is an actual essential worker in our society. It's not a banker, right? It is not those rich corporate lawyers. It is not the CEOs. It's the people working on the front lines. they will try to say, shift it back and say, oh, those are the people we need to turn to. So we have to be prepared to defend ourselves. We have to be prepared and organized today to expand rights. We need to say we need a single tier society where the people who are most essential are valued, which means permanent resident status for everyone. I absolutely think that we are in the process of, imagining what the new world looks like, because none of us want to go back to normal. There is no return to normal where we can't feed ourselves, where we can't cross the street, where a mother can't put her child in school because she's afraid that she'll be deported. There is no normal when you can't live on your land or go onto a highway because, if you're an Indigenous woman, you may be kidnapped. There is no normal where Indigenous self-determination for centuries has been extracted. There's no normal of anti-Black racism that we want to return to. But there's no normal of national security apparatus and the mass murder of Muslims and women, as we've seen again and again, like mass instances of white male rage and domestic violence, like we saw most recently in Nova Scotia. That's not the normal we want. But we won't have it. But they will try to sell it to us. They will try to make beautiful ads on TV and tell us to just calm down and get back to normal. And I think it's really important that we have to ask ourselves, where is our power? What are we willing to do? What are we capable of doing? What will we do when that happens? Can we actually, shut down Canada again, as the Wet'suwet'en have shown us is so critical to be able to make any changes happen? Remember, that was just a few weeks ago, right? That's what it will take. We will have to you have to be prepared to shut this country down again and again and again and again to not be faced with an immense attack that is coming our way. So there's an opportunity and there is a danger, and we must be prepared for both.
I just wanted to know if any of the other panelists wanted to speak about that as well. If you think that, within this pandemic, what do you see as this being an opportunity to completely transform the food system, Cheyenne, and to do things that are long overdue, like localized food systems? And same for you, Carolyn. How can this pandemic be seen as an opportunity to completely revolutionize the way the whole land back movement and other realities for Indigenous communities? I was hoping that each of you could speak to that.
Yeah. I can maybe, so I see that this pandemic does shine a light on how broken the food system is, and whether that be how small farms get hardly any subsidies compared to large conventional monocrop culture farms, or even the city's lack of care of urban agriculture and how we don't even have chickens yet. But all of these things combined really makes us see the broken urban agriculture scene and also the food system in this whole. So I'll speak about a few things that I feel like are key for a resilient food system, or that would be a really good place for it. One thing is education. So when we're thinking about how people have the ability to grow food, yes, you can teach yourself, read books, but there's nothing like being mentored or taught by someone who actually knows how to plant that corn, or plant that seed, or trellis that tomato. And that's a very, very important skill, right? And I would say for me, farming, I became a really good farmer once I had an expert farmer guide me and teach me. So really, how do people get this education though? When we're thinking about how do you become a farmer, let's say you live in the city, or let's say you live in a food apartheid, so an area that doesn't have access to fresh, affordable produce because of city planning, how are you going to be learning to be a farmer? Can you go, or do you have the resources to go to Guelph and maybe live in Guelph in a neighborhood or community that doesn't look like your own, that doesn't have culturally relevant food to you, that maybe you don't feel safe in as well because there's not a lot of racial representation if you're a person of color? Or do you also have the opportunity to spend thousands of dollars studying for an agricultural degree or horticultural degree to then get a job at a sector or an area that can pay you maybe a livable salary? So that's a way you can become a farmer. Another way you can become a farmer is working on a farm. So woofing or volunteering, but also keep in mind, are these areas that people, let's say Black folks who are heavily policed, feel comfortable in walking at night? right? When I was roofing with some of my friends, and most of my friends are Black farmers, we didn't feel safe in rural Ontario at nighttime walking by ourselves to just go to the corner store. So are these places that we feel safe and we feel healing to grow food? And especially considering that for Black folks growing food, it is a healing act itself, right? Reconnecting with the land and understanding that Mother Earth wasn't the perpetrator of the crime, it was the scene of the crime in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and its connection to farming. So having a relationship with the earth and being able to grow food, especially like as someone who's Black, is something to really focus on about who's going to be teaching that growing, right? And this can go for anyone who has been affected by colonialism, environmental racism, Black and Indigenous people who both face the most amount of food insecurity across Canada. So who are teaching these populations who have the most effect on food insecurity, right? Are there people that are our own? Is it Indigenous elders? Is it Black mentors who've been farming for years? Oftentimes it's not. So I feel like for a resilient food system, and also to talk about what the food system could look like going forward, it must have the voices of Black and Indigenous people. It must have the voices of what Indigenous food sovereignty looks like by Indigenous people themselves. It must have that self-determination in that actual factor. And it also looks like strictly education. So right now in the city of Toronto, if a youth wanted to grow food or become a farmer one day, they have very, very slim choices about where to get that education and that information, especially for free or low cost. So having workshops or programs that teach hard skills, and by hard skills, I mean not maybe learning about the back of a seed package, but learning about how to drive a tractor or how to take care of bees or understanding the waterways, or also composting and things like that, that you kind of need to overall grow food for yourself and your community. If we have these skills and these workshops in place, I truly think that will help youth grow food. Because to tell a young person, let's say living in Toronto, where their whole community is here, you must go to Milton, you must go to Guelph to be a farmer, that basically tells them that their own city isn't good enough, right? That we don't even have the implements here to grow that food. So I think creating a strong community system and also having educational workshops is a part of going forward in a just and proper food system. And then I guess the last piece is, because I don't want to run on too long, is having community-owned farms, ideally on community-owned land. For example, there's not a lot of community land trusts in Toronto. There's a Parkdale Land Trust, which actually in Parkdale has a community garden called the Milky Way Garden, where largely the Tibetan neighborhood grows lots of bitter melons and cool foods that are culturally relevant to them. But we don't have a lot of community-owned land urban farms. For example, down south in the States, they have a lot of that. I've noticed when I visited there to learn more about urban ag. In Detroit, they have some really awesome community-owned farms and cooperative stores, grocery stores. So looking at them and looking at how this community that was resilient in the face of food insecurity really rose up, has the Detroit D-Town Farm, has Mandela Food Co-op in California, for example. That's a California example. How are we going to really create our own food system in Toronto that is just and also that is sustainable and resilient? And I truly think that's having community-owned farms, because that means that the community is in charge of their own food sovereignty. That doesn't mean the city of Toronto can take away that food security with community gardens, right? When we're looking at right now what's open, community gardens, allotment gardens still aren't open. However, privately owned land like my greenhouse, or even land that's located not on the city's land, but the Black Creek Community Farm, school-grown gardens, things like that. Black Creek Community Farms is open, right? Because they have the ability to stay open because they're not dictated by the city's rule. And I feel like that key piece is very important for food sovereignty, because moving forward, in case something else happens, it's good to know that we have control over the food production, the seed production, and how and when we can grow food. So I feel like the key point of education and teaching folks who want to grow food, especially who are from the most marginalized groups, to grow food in whatever way they see fit is important. And then secondary, creating more community-owned farms, so larger than a community garden, an acre or half an acre, to really have intensive food production.
Thanks. Carolyn, did you want to answer? Did you want me to read a question, or?
You know, I would just add, you know, I think both speakers said so much that's relevant, and I just want to touch upon what Said had mentioned, and how important it is for people to be aware and not be distracted by mainstream media, what's going on with the virus. We know it throughout history, disaster capitalism thrives on these sorts of situations. And it's really important for people to be aware of what's happening during this time that's not being reported in mainstream media. And, you know, these are the times when environmental regulations become lax. These are the times when legislation gets passed through and people start to lose some of their rights. So that's the one emphasis that I want to say is really pay attention to what's happening, because it may require further disruption, as Syed had mentioned. We know that we can shut down Canada if it was necessary. And you know, in order to ensure that there is a just systems in place for everyone is so critical. And yes, we cannot return back to normal, you know, and business as usual. Something has to shift. People have been stirred and woken in some sense to kind of see what's really behind the curtain when we talk about the mainstream, you know. So it's really important that people pay attention to what's happening. And, you know, instead of just like, you know, the petitions, but like actually standing up for what we need to change. We need action today. And figuring out creative ways of protesting when there are these restrictions that are put in place, because there's many discussions around that as well.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to say thanks also to like Hasan and Carolyn for bringing up how not that long ago, many of us were all on the blockades and helping to shut down in solidarity with the Wet Sweatin. And so lots of things are possible, and for us to not forget about those. So another thing that's come up, the issue of income inequality has come up a few times tonight, both from all of you as panelists and from everyone watching in our comments. So do we need to address income inequality in order to resolve food justice issues?
Maybe I can just start. I mean, I think the way to think about it is, you know, I mean, Carolyn just said it, right? So Corona is the virus. Capitalism is the pandemic, you know, and the pandemic that we are facing is capitalism, which is completely and totally transformed through race, through class, through gender, through sexuality, through your citizenship status, and it's made worse by it, right? Those are the ways in which capitalism operates. And so income inequality is one of the functions of capitalism. The rich get richer, so the rest of us get poorer. We have to understand that between 1971 and today, both the minimum wage and the average wage in places like, even like Canada, have remained constant when you calculate for inflation. They've not gone up since 1971. On the other hand, the profits, which means have grown up exponentially of the richest few. What does that mean? It means our productivity is increasing. We're making more profit, but we're not getting a cut. That is why there are billionaires today. You know, I think people don't understand, but like, you know, how much is $1 billion? 1 million, if you think about it in seconds of time, 1 million seconds of time is 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds of time is 31.5 years. That is how much more a billion is to a million. And that is how much more wealth there is in the hands of very few. So income inequality is actually, again, it's a function or a system through which we are seeing capitalism operate itself. And it's not just income inequality, but that those at the bottom are made to fight each other for scraps. Low-wage workers in New Brunswick today, for example, they said, we're closing the border to migrant workers. What are they doing? There's a huge amount of unemployment in New Brunswick because there's a lot of people in seasonal work who are not getting seasonal work. And they're saying the problem is not the people at the top, the rich, but it's the other racialized low-wage worker. Indigenous people are told it's migrants. Migrants are told it's Indigenous people. Poor people, working class people are made to fight each other after our incomes have been reduced through state-sponsored propaganda, frankly, and through media that tells us, look, we are, you know, if you don't have enough income, it's somebody who has less than you who's taking it away from you. So food insecurity is then again another. So why is there food insecurity? I mean, Cheyenne spoke to it a lot, but and so did Carolyn, right? Like those are functions. Colonialism has a function. Racism has a function. There are no food deserts in, predominantly rich people neighborhoods. Food apartheid doesn't exist in communities where there is a lot of wealth. People who have cars and can get deliveries are in a very different situation than the rest. So absolutely, we need to understand that the pandemic that we are facing is capitalism, but it does not function outside of race and gender and sexuality and ability. These are not separations. And particularly when we're living in a settler colony, we're living in one of the few places in the world where the colonizer has not left, but instead the colonizer has stayed, put up its buildings, decided it controls immigration, and then told the rest of us to come to apply for immigration status. But at its root, that is how it's interconnected. So absolutely, everything needs to be dealt with through understanding these integrated systems, and which is why we need to fight on all fronts together.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Cheyenne or Carolyn?
If Carolyn doesn't have it, I can add something. Okay,
Sure.
cool. So what I would say is that food insecurity is not caused by a lack of food, it's a lack of income. Food insecure people, and this is coming from someone who is quite food insecure myself, understand what is healthy food and they understand that they need food. But if you don't have income, you're not going to decide. Well, most people decide to spend their income on things that are fixed, right? Because because food budgets can be kind of flowy, right? If you have a fixed hydro bill, a fixed phone bill, or a Metro Pass, you're going to pay that firstly before you pay your grocery budget, because you'll just decide, okay, maybe I won't buy the nice rye bread, I'll buy the Wonder Bread. And then maybe after a few months, you'll just buy the ravioli instead of maybe the pasta. And that's really how it trickles into the system, food insecurity. You put the food cost last because you simply don't have a choice. So when I'm talking about like low income folks and food security in the food system, I truly think without having a fair income and without at least having 15 for fairness and having a living wage, really, how are we going to be supporting low-income folks in their own food security missions? And when I'm saying food security, I'm not really saying food sovereignty, because it's quite hard to fight for food sovereignty when you're food insecure, because you're really not going to be thinking about, oh, I have to advocate, I have to write to my MPP, I have to do all this activism work. If you're hungry and if your kids are hungry, you're going to be thinking about providing that food itself. So I would say food insecurity is exacerbated so much by capitalism, by the gig economy, and by minimum wage, and also undignified work that's not dignified, for example. So in Toronto, it's very hard, for example, to sell food, to sell your own produce, to grow that food and make a living from that. You actually cannot sell produce from community gardens. There's a bylaw against that. So that also speaks to how much the city of Toronto is not actually focusing on creating work and new dignified jobs with growing food in the city. So that's kind of why like options like yard sharing are a fairly good option for folks who have the skills to grow food, want to generate some income, and also maybe get some education from that, from hands-on experience, because you can sell food from backyards. And I'm not just saying that making income from food and selling it is a solution to food sovereignty. It's not, but it can truly help someone's own food security. So that's the kind of part I would say is understanding that income has a large part to play in the food movement and also creating a resilient food system. And oftentimes in conversations about food sovereignty and maybe building a great food, just food future, the folks in the room aren't the folks who are actually should be in the room, right? If someone's mom is working 2 jobs, they're really not going to want to come to a city hall meeting about creating a new urban farm. So it's also about, if you're a part of a nonprofit or community group or organization, how are you getting those voices in the room who just cannot be there because they're too tired or they're just stretched too thin from capitalism?
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to take a last question before we wrap up. And after we wrap up, we're going to have an amazing musical guest. So everyone, please stay tuned. So the last question that we're taking has to do with education. And I think, Cheyenne, I think you spoke to some of this before, but I want to open this up to all 3 panelists. Okay. So this question came to us from Paul Strom. Thank you, Paul, for the question. And thank you to everyone who asked us questions. Sorry if we weren't able to ask all of them. So what role do you see the education system playing regarding the issues you have talked about this evening? Schools, and then schools should be teaching how to apply food growing practices and use those skills in a practical way on school grounds, local land, close schools where possible. and wanted to ask the panelists for suggestions. And I would just open that up to also Indigenous knowledge and also knowledge about where our food is coming from in terms of migrant workers and working conditions and all of that. So I just wanted to open that up to all three of you. Does anyone want to take a first go? What should people be learning in school to tackle these issues and to make it so that we know more about our food, more about food sovereignty, Indigenous knowledge related to food, and about migrant workers?
I can go ahead and just speak just from my experience working with the schools around building school food gardens and so forth, and just a lot of the challenges, a lot of bureaucracy around getting food gardens in, a lot of concerns around structures, around fruit being projectiles, and all of that sort of thing. And so I think it's really important that when we're thinking about these schools, that there are the possibilities of school food gardens and bringing community together in that. And, trying to make the process a lot easier for those things to happen, to be able to support teachers that are interested, and to have the funds to actually support community members who are interested in such projects. I think it's really important that all educators in the school system, so whether they're a teacher or a support worker, whatever their role might be, I think it's important that they actually are aware of the true history of what's known today as Canada. To have an awareness of their place as a treaty person, I think is really important. And I think that information needs to be conveyed to within the school system for people to have an understanding. What does it mean to be a treaty person? What are the responsibilities? How does one move forward in where they're at and in Canada today? So yeah, I think that's the big piece, is the education, to make sure that everybody's on the same page about the history, and then having programs where people can have access to learning about different cultural foods, and having opportunities for other cultural programs to come into the school system as well. But I'm just touching a little bit on that.
Maybe I'll just say a few things, Shan, unless you want to jump in.
I can jump in.
Okay, yeah, I'll go after.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So speaking on education and children and them learning to grow food, when we're speaking about like a city context, it really firstly starts with normalizing food growing in the city. So when you're a child and you're kind of seeing things, the first thing you probably notice if you go on a field trip, for example, I went on a field trip to Pioneer Village when I was in elementary school, and I thought the sheep were so cool. And I was like, oh, there's goats and there's sheep in the city. There's all this corn. I was like so jazzed about it. I remember I couldn't stop talking about it. But the thing is, that was an anomaly. I've never seen a farm. I didn't see a farm until I was like 18 in Cuba, really. And I never really seen a working system of the sheeps, they have a good time, and the sheep manure is used to fertilize the tomatoes and all of that beautiful cycle. So as a child, my only experience with seeing a farm, whether that be Pioneer Farm, and maybe not a full production farm, but it's something, was of me maybe seeing a factor of I could be a farmer one day, right? A child having representation of urban farming or even farming as in general as agriculture is very important for them to actually see themselves in the role of being a farmer, a land steward, or someone who just grows food for themselves and their community. As a kid, I never thought I could be a farmer. And speaking today at 23 years old, having like a year-round farm, I'm very surprised I do this because I never wanted to be a farmer, but I knew that when I finally got representation and when I went to Cuba and I saw a lot of Afro-Cubans and Indigenous folks growing food there and having a really good time with community, I then saw myself in that role because I saw direct representation. And that's so crucial. So the second piece about education is just because it's also maybe being taught in school or there's an after-school program, who is teaching that education? Is it someone who looks like the kid? let's say this is a low-income neighborhood, maybe a low-income neighborhood that is a food apartheid and has a lot of like a youth who are maybe in conflict with the law or something like that too. Are the folks who are teaching the kids to grow food maybe at these at-risk kids, because that's often used to describe kids who are actually just dealing with the effects of police brutality and also food apartheid? Are these kids being taught by people who look like them? Are the facilitators folks who have the same lived experiences in oppression and marginalization? Oftentimes no with after school programs. Oftentimes no when someone's trying to maybe make a connection with a youth who's at risk, right? If we don't have folks who are teaching these youth as a peer-to-peer mentor, the knowledge usually gets lost in translation, because having someone who has the direct same experience, whether that be an elder, a mentor, or just someone who understands the struggle that you're going through in this capitalist colonization society, is very, very important, right? So I feel like a child learning to grow food itself is great, but who is teaching that knowledge? And if we're speaking about sharing knowledge through generations and generational learning, it's very important to also include elders and people who maybe have more mentoring skills and pass that down the line to create an intergenerational knowledge and not lose things like seed keeping and food preservation. So I would say that, and I would say that it's very also important to have representation and also racial representation, because I will say it again, Black and Indigenous people face the most food insecurity across Canada. So it's very, very important to have representation when we're teaching our own youth these skills.
I'll just jump in with a couple of points. I think the first thing we really need to understand is that, as I was saying earlier, this, there are three corporations that control most of the beef production. There are 5 corporations that control all of the grocery stores. The vast amount of food in this country is being controlled, grown, produced, packaged, sold, delivered by very, very few corporations. And so it is not simply a question of a few of us just starting food growing in our yards or our balconies. And that's not going to be enough to deal with the state of the crisis. So we have to be able to accompany our work it's not enough to just grow your own food, because you can't just opt out of the system, because 99.999% of the people cannot. So that's one thing. On the question of the role of schools and education, I want to do something, Cheyenne used this term like food dreaming. So what does food dreaming look like in the context of schools? What would it mean to have a completely transformed society where schools served as hubs, where every day 10 families from that neighborhood would come and be responsible for that school? And that the growing of food wouldn't just be done by the children, but all of the adults in that neighborhood. And that those adults would come in, help the children grow the food, and they themselves would learn, and they would grow the food, and they would share it with the students. And that the students would also wouldn't just be teachers or receivers of knowledge, but they would be teaching those around them. And so there would be this notion of that the entire community would be centralized around the care of the young and the elderly, where elderly people could be also part of this, farm/schooling. And I say these things, for example, you mentioned this before, Cheyenne, but this is part of how the landless peasant movement in Brazil organizes its schools, but that there is an entirely different conception of what schooling could look like. If we are saying we're in a pandemic, the normal is not good enough, and we want to get out of it, we need to start completely talking about getting out of it, not just making minor tweaks to it, because it's not going to be simply reshaping. If normal is bad, let's actually talk about what extraordinary, which is, what our basic needs are. Those are considered extraordinary, which is care, love, collectivity, food, connection, and how is an education system can actually build that. Thanks.
So much to everyone. And so I just wanted to point out, we're seeing tremendous global efforts to fight the coronavirus, and this kind of mobilization is proof that we can undertake drastic change and transform our food systems to protect people in making key changes, and we can also tackle the climate emergency, which we are still very much confronting. And so I just wanted to point out that there is very much a connection between increased temperature of the planet, the erosion of biodiversity, encroachment upon indigenous peoples and territories, including the destruction of animal habitats as a result of extractive industries and industrial agriculture, which some of the panelists have spoken to tonight. And this is often driven by large agribusiness, giant food corporations. And so I wanted to also point out further this link between health, labor, economic, social, and ecological inequalities and inequities, these conditions that are engendered by the commodification of our food, which is imposed on all of us by those corporations and corporate agribusiness entities and multinational food giants that are controlling our global food supply chains. And they're clearer than ever in this time of crisis. So what I really want to encourage everyone to do is I want to encourage all of us to be daring and courageous. I'm inviting all of us to challenge ourselves to take into account all that we've been witnessing during this pandemic, into questioning and wondering by trying to really imagine what a new, more just and equitable new normal looks like. And let us really use this time, if we have the luxury to realize a food system transformation that we did not think was possible on a huge scale and rapidly. And I wanted to let people know that if they're interested in joining the Emergency Food Forum and really interested in networking with people working in the food system, to send me an email. My email is ypeer@greenpeace.org. I've been hosting a series of dialogues and exchanges with people that are working in the food system, farmers and food system allies, and people working in food distribution, localized food distribution. And we've been trying to come up with some actionable solutions. So please send me an email if you want to be looped into that network. I wanted to thank all the panelists. And now I want to let everyone know that next up we have an amazing musical performance. It is by Lal, Rosina Kazi, and Nicholas Murray. They're a Toronto-based protest electronic duo, and they've built a career out of daring audiences to be their best selves, coming from the worlds of hip hop, punk, and experimental music. Lal blends those influences into the smoothest, richest shape that will enliven body, mind, and soul. And their beats and melodies can charm the most cynical clubhead, softening them up so that their lyrics of anger, sadness, and possibility can warm their way deep inside. So their newest album, Dark Beings, was longlisted for the 2019 Polaris Music Prize, and they spend much of their time supporting the QTB BIPOC Friends through their DIT community space, Unit 2 in Toronto. Nick and Ro currently live in Toronto, which is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenni-Lenape, and the Wendat nations. So take it away, Lal.
She's dancing. Oh, Yasmin.
You just have to unmute yourself.
I was blabbing. I was saying thank you, Cheyenne, Carolyn, Hasan, Yasmin, for having us. We are Lal. Dark Beings is kind of the musical interpretation of everything that you were all talking about. And so if you need a chance just to stretch or to move or to dance, like please take the opportunity to do so, because this is really heavy subjects and heavy information. And we need to be able to take that information, put it through our souls and spirits, our bodies, our minds, and then put it back out in a way that we can really create some change. Yeah, here we go. And I'll just mention, we have some projections in the background, and this is from Jose Garcia. Shout out to Guelph. We have always destroyed what we hate to create something new, to create something new. If you add fire to the equation, and then you throw in some truth, and then you throw in the truth, and then you throw in the truth. We've been doing this shit for a while. We remember we are proof. And as the sky comes falling down around, some still don't know what to do. Some still don't know what to do. Some still don't know what to do. Oh, maybe it's time we felt and we listen to vibrations, in depth of the system. Oh, in depth of the system. Oh. Dark beings, dark beings, dark beings, dark beings, dark beings, dark beings. We are dark beings, dark beings, dark beings, dark beings. Dark beings. Learn to cultivate all around us. Grown to cultivate all around us. Despite all the scars we have seen for centuries lined up, are we with the stars? We are planted seeds in the ground. Inside us is goddess, I feel free. Goddess, I feel free. Goddess, I feel free from the spirit of it all. Maybe it's time we felt and we listen to vibrations, to vibrations, to vibrations, to vibrations. Dark beings, dark beings, dark beings, dark beings. Mate manush amre, mate manush amre, mate manush amre, mate manush amre, mate. Maybe it's time we felt and we listen. We felt the vibrations, felt the vibrations. We are dark beings. We are dark beings. We are. This next song is called I Am Goddess, and it's trying to speak or communicate from the perspective of the land or from Mother Earth, which is not gendered for me. And there's a video that's out by Diane Smith, so check it out. This is their last song. Welcome to my table. Won't you come and join? Won't you come and join? I will listen if you stop. Know that I am torn, reborn. Can you feel my deep wounds? I can feel yours, I can feel yours. At least I have the courage to face you in my storm, face you in my storm, face you in my storm, face you in my storm. I am goddess, don't you forget it. I am goddess, don't you forget. I am goddess, don't you forget it. We killing off goddess. We killing off goddess. We killing off ourselves. We killing off. We killing off. We killing off. You have learned to hate me. Why should I forgive? Each war that you go through, life I must rebuild. This shit ain't just about you. World shatters in rage, world shatters in rage. How can we forget though? We have lost what's left. 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 I am Goddess, don't you forget it. I am Goddess, don't you forget. I am Goddess, don't you forget it. I am Goddess, don't you forget, don't you forget, don't you forget, don't you forget. You think we're stupid, but we know how you. You think we're stupid, but we know how you do things. You should watch how you move. You think we're stupid, but we know how you do things. You should watch how you move. This is magic vengeance for my bloody best friends. This is magic vengeance for my bloody best friends. This is magic vengeance for my bloody best friends. Bringing back, bringing back, bringing back the moon in full. I am Goddess, you are Goddess, he is Goddess, she is Goddess, we are Goddess, they are Goddess. I am Goddess, you are Goddess, he is, she is Goddess, we are. It's been so, long. This fighting and day, this fighting and day, this fighting and day. We killing off our say, our say, our say. Thank you.
Thank you so much
Hope
to
that was
everyone.
okay.
Thank you so much to everyone that's tuned in. Thank you, Lal. That was amazing. Thank you to Cheyenne Sundance, Carolyn Crawley, and Sayed Hassan. If you have any calls to action, you can say them now, and we can also post them on our channels. Liberating Lawns, Cheyenne, how can people find out about it?
Yes, so to find out more about Liberating Lawns, which is basically a yard sharing service matching growers to landholders in the city of Toronto, you can go to my website, sundanceharvestfarm.com, and you can click on the tab that says Liberating Lawns. Highly recommend you get in contact with me via only my website, as I usually don't really respond to Instagram or Facebook messages. And to find out about Sundance Harvest, my Instagram is Sundance Harvest. I'm very active on there. And yeah, DM me and we can hang out and chat.
Carolyn, did you have anything you wanted to share with our viewers? Anywhere to direct them?
I just wanted to mention Yellowhead Institute. On their website, there's one First Nation that is requiring donations of goods. And so they have it posted as to drop off, no contact dropped off locations in Toronto, the city of Toronto, for those that have any supplies that they can offer as well. So maybe just checking out that if someone feels called to donate some goods. Also, a call of action is really, you know, when I think about this work, food justice, land rights, whatever it might be, it all boils down to relationships. Relationship with ourselves, relationship with each other, and relationship with the land, the water, the beings. And so really to prioritize the relationships in everything that we do today. And how do we do that? By starting with ourselves. And so that's one thing I just suggest with people during this time: find a way to connect deeper with the land, find your place with the land, and, you know, be aware of what's happening. Let's stand together.
Miigwech, Wilalin, merci. Thank you to everyone tuning in. And please check out, don't forget the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change website tomorrow to do the actions that Hassan was talking to us about. Thank you to everyone that tuned in, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Lal. That was amazing.